You may remember last year that I built this small parts routing jig. As the name implies, it's a jig for routing small parts, particularly for operations like stopped dados. Traditionally, you do that at a router table by plunging the workpiece onto a moving bit, and that has never sat very well with me. So I made this jig to allow me to use a plunge router on top of the workpiece. The key here is that it is securing the workpiece from the sides, so there's no clamps getting in the way of the routing operation. And because the router is referencing off these surfaces here, the router won't rock around or anything like that. It is quite stable. I've used this jig genuinely more times than I thought I would. This was quite a quick jig to achieve a particular task, but I'm starting to find that I'm using this in my workflow more and more. Small boxes are always a hassle to make, but with something like this, they're really not. However, there are a few improvements, so move over. Version 2 introduces T-track with adjustable stops and a pin so I can do repeatable positioning of workpieces, so I could do a dozen of these without having to adjust anything. Plus, for version 1 I didn't really do a build video, so in this video I've done a proper build video so you can see how it all goes together, as well as a demo at the end. I'm using some 18mm pine plywood for this jig. It's first cut down from an offcut and then taken to the table saw. It's ripped lengthwise into the 4 parts needed. Really is that simple, 4 pieces of plywood. All parts are 500mm long. The base is 280mm wide, the fixed front fence is 90mm wide, the moving clamping face is 40mm, and finally the backstop is just 25mm. Next up is cutting the dado for the T-track. I first make several test cuts to get the height dialed in perfectly. The T-track must sit slightly below the surface. Here you can see on the second pass that I'm just a hair deeper to really dial in that depth. After I'm happy with the depth, I start cutting the groove on the fixed front fence. I deliberately left the stack narrower than the T-track as it's easier to just do a second pass. At the drill press I'm drilling a set of staggered holes for the positioning pin parallel with the front edge of the jig. These are 6mm holes spaced 50mm apart on each row, with the second row offset by 25mm. You really don't need to go more than halfway across the jig. No glue here, just countersunk screws to secure the front fence. Ideally the base and the fixed fence edge will be perfectly flush, however if that's not possible, just make the fixed fence overhang slightly. Fixed fence is the only piece that needs to be parallel with itself, so by making that overhang the router edge guide will reference correctly. The T-track can be secured with just itty bitty baby screws. There are dozens of different ways to make wedges. This is just one way that happened to work surprisingly well where neither wedge needed tweaking. A piece of plywood with an 8-degree shape pre-cut into it let me load up some scrap hardwood to make the wedges. One of the big differences with version 2 of this jig is that it has a track for stops. Before we make the stop, we need to talk about what type of stops will and won't work. This is the type of stop I use on my drill press fence. Let's just for a moment pretend that it's actually the right distance, but it doesn't really matter. This is just a demonstration of why it won't work for this type of application. If the router is set to whatever that depth of cut is, it'll engage there, but if we change maybe a shallower depth, you can see that it's changed where it's engaging on the router base. That means if you're doing multiple passes to get the width, the depth is going to change. What we really need is a stop that goes all the way across, so it doesn't really matter what the depth is, it's always going to engage on the same point. One additional complexity is that this is a moving fence here, so we can't have it engaged in 2 spots there. We could on the back one, and we could embed some T-track in there, but that's probably a little bit wasteful. Instead, there's a couple of things we can do. We can add 2 knobs to the stops, makes them a little bit wider, but they will be nice and secure. We're not really slamming the router into it, so it's not too much of an issue in terms of flex or anything like that. Another way to add a little bit more security is something that this flip stop has, which is a small key that goes into the track itself that stops it from pivoting all that much when it's locked down. We can achieve that by gluing on a piece of wood. We'll see whether it's needed, but first let's make the stop that is wide enough to have two knobs attached to it. The actual position of the holes doesn't really matter, they just need to be in a straight line with the edge. The shallow groove is for a key, it's just easier to align everything for gluing with a shallow groove. The key is thickness down to fit in the groove. Again, just scrap hardwood. Pretty much anything except for MDF would work here. The key is then glued into the groove and later hand planed down to be a little bit shallower so it doesn't interfere with the bolt head. A couple of things I didn't cover. This back strip, which provides support for the wedges, is just screwed in, nothing fancy there. And one of the wedges gets screwed in. You don't need to do this, but it's a lot easier to secure everything when one of the wedges isn't moving. I can, with finger pressure, push that in, but when I'm having to do two of them, it's hard to keep everything lined up. Then I can come back with a mallet and hit that into position, whereas if I have to do both of them, it's just a little bit more awkward. The other thing is I'm using 5/16 inch hardware for my T-track. That's what this particular T-track is designed for. This is a T-bolt. Makes it a lot easier to secure things. And for the knobs, I'm using 3D printed knobs, link in the description for these ones that I found. These I find are really great because of the nice knurled surface on them. And they're just printed threads that then get tapped to clean them out a little bit. I find they work really well, and compared to a lot of the commercial ones, they're really quite small, so that allows me to have a smaller stop because I don't have to worry about the knob getting in the way. So I've got the small parts jig here. It's slightly hanging over the edge of the bench. I've got it pinched between a bench dog and my tail vise. If you don't have a tail vise, you could obviously make the platform a little bit bigger so that there's room for a clamp. The scenario is I've got this workpiece that I'd like a stopped groove in. Normally you'd take this to the router table, plunge down and go across. It's a little bit dodgy and scary trying to grip onto the piece and plunging it onto a moving router bit. This piece is a little bit too small that you could not normally place a plunge router on it, because how are you going to secure the workpiece in place? So we're going to load this into the small parts jig. Well, imagine that we've got a dozen of these to do and they're all the same size, so we want to have a reference point. So I take my brass pin and put it in any of these stops. It doesn't really matter which one. We want this roughly in the center of the jig, as that does help with clamping. We've got the locking wedge there and my handy dandy block. This is now going nowhere. Because I've got the reference pin there, I can reference every single one of these up against the same pin, and they'll all be in the same position for when we use the stops. The stops go into the T-track, secure down. There's a little key there that helps stop them from spinning. So I can place my router on, line up where I want the bit to go, my start and stop points, move my stops, and we're right to go. The edge guide of the router controls how deep this cut is, I guess width-wise, on the workpiece. If I make adjustments here, we've got support on both sides, and I can very safely and easily make that groove. So as you can see, this works really quite well. The improvements in version 2 are really quite nice, and while they do add a little bit to the build time, we're still talking about an afternoon's build. It's not a really big project, but it is very helpful. It's a bit of a shame I didn't have these stops for making the salt cellars or even the drawer handles I've been working on, because this would have really sped up the process. You may notice that one of the stops has gone to 6mm material rather than the 19mm I originally used. And that's because the dust collection on this particular router sticks out the back, and it was actually hitting on the stop, so it wasn't great. No big deal, it's the exact same design, I've just used thinner material. The thicker one does, I guess, grip a little bit better for whatever reason, maybe a bit less flex. You could argue to make this a lot stiffer and more accurate, but we're not talking about needing, you know, 0.5mm accuracy when we're cutting those grooves. It just needs to be fairly repeatable. So if you do want to do that, make this whole stop a bit wider, maybe a triangle piece with 2 knobs, and it'll be much more secure. But I found that these are pretty secure. We're not really going to hit our router hard up against that stop. And if you are, you need to reevaluate your life choices. It's a router, it's not a mallet. Get it together. I don't think something like this really needs plans. The dimensions and the accuracy of it aren't really all that critical. You need a straight parallel piece here. That's about it. However, I do have dimensional drawings which are free. Link in the description below if you are interested. If you do build one of these and you do make any improvements, I'd love to hear about it, because this is one of those things that's just light bulb moment, aha. It's a lot easier to do a whole bunch of routing tasks now, and I've been really enjoying it. Thanks for watching. Why'd you have to actually throw it? Could have just pretended. The floor is way too far away.